Good evening, everyone. My name is John Taves, and I'm the event coordinator here at McNally Robinson Booksellers. Before we begin, I would like to acknowledge that we are gathered tonight in Treaty 1 territory, the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and the homeland of the Métis Nation. In addition, McNally Robinson Booksellers itself rests on the land once occupied by the Métis community of Roostertown. We are here tonight gathered both physically and virtually to celebrate the launch of Dadibaajim, Returning Home Through Narrative by Helen Olsen Agger. Before we begin, I'd just like to offer a few very brief housekeeping notes, and then I'll introduce some of tonight's participants. First of all, we're going to be beginning with a short presentation from Sonia Lundstrom, after which Dr. Jarvis Brownlee will come out to introduce Helen, who will then speak from behind this podium about the book. Moving along after that, we'll be moving to a conversation which will take place just to my left, which nobody on YouTube can see, but is in the area just over to the side of the podium, at which point there will be a conversation between Dr. Brownlee and Helen. Following that, there will be an opportunity to ask questions, and that will happen in two ways. Physically here in the space, we'll ask you just to put up your hand, and then you can ask the question to me, at which point I will repeat it into the microphone for the benefit of those present here, as well as the benefit of all those watching on YouTube, both now and in the future. With that in mind, I will just gently and humbly ask that it be in the form of a question rather than an extended comment, simply because my brain no longer has the capacity to remember anything longer than 1 or 2 sentences. And I'm very grateful for that. At the close of that, we'll move along to the signing portion of the evening. I'll be back to review the details of that again near the end, but just to preemptively let you know, the signing will take place just beside our front cash desk. Books will be available for sale behind the front cash desk. And once we leave this area, we will move from the performance to the retail world, which means that we will remain masked, but also begin to socially distance as soon as we leave the space and approach the table. That is more than enough for me. I would like to thank everybody at the University of Manitoba Press, not only for publishing this book, but also for making this evening possible and for all their incredible organizational help. Now, I would like to begin by introducing the first person to speak tonight. Sonia Lundstrom is a retired nurse, mama of 2 grandsons, mother of 2 daughters. She is president of the Swedish Cultural Association. Born and raised in Red Lake, Ontario, she is a friend of Helen's with a passion for the land, the rocks, water, and trees of Ontario. Please join me in welcoming Sonia Lundstrom.
So my hearing aids. I'm just so very pleased to be here as Helen launches her book. Helen, you're truly a bright light for all of us. As I heard the places of Northwestern Ontario that we have shared together, Manitou Falls, Spruce Lake, Trout River, just brought tears to my eyes of those wonderful, wonderful places that we've shared. Your bright light is one that's going to lead us to listening and learning and sharing in this journey of truth and reconciliation. Gitchi Miigwech.
Thank you so much, Sonia. I now have the opportunity to introduce the moderator and host of this evening. Dr. Jarvis Brownlee is a settler Canadian who teaches history at the University of Manitoba. His research focuses on settler colonialism in Canada, Crown First Nations relations, treaties, and oral history. He has published widely on issues such as the Indian agent system, Indigenous rights and treaties, and racial discourses in Canada. He is currently involved in community-based collaborative research with Cree communities in northern Manitoba on the impacts of hydro dams since the 1960s. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Jarvis Brownlee.
Thanks, John. Okay, so great. So I too am very honored to be here and to host this evening in celebration of Helen's latest book, hopefully not her last. So Helen was born and grew up in the Trout Lake homelands of her Anishinaabe mother, Namegosibii, the Namegosibii Anishinaabeg. She lives in Winnipeg along with her spouse, Garth, her mother, Dedibaayaanimanook. I hope that's somewhat close. Her daughter, Leslie, and granddaughter, Amelia. Helen followed the post-secondary education path right up to the very top, to the final degree as a PhD in Indigenous Studies at the University of Manitoba. So I was being called Dr. Brownlee, but she, of course, has the right to the title too, Dr. Agger. Her first book, following Nimishoomis, The Trout Lake History of Dedibaayaanimanook, Sarah Keesick Olsen, came out in 2008, and that's how I first encountered her remarkable work. I know of no other work like it. It's very important. It's unique, and she just provides such a window into a world that is very rich, and the world of her group of Anishinaabe people. And she traced the life story of her mother, senior Anishinaabe elder Dedibaayaanimanook, and in this latest book is again the fruits of her many years of learning Anishinaabe teachings and narrative and philosophy and understandings from her mother. She speaks Anishinaabe herself as a second language. And this book is based on other narratives her current work that's coming up is based on other narratives of Dedibaayaanimanook that she describes as replete with knowledge that becomes increasingly relevant in today's world. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Helen Agger.
Thank you for those wonderful words, Sonia, and thank you, Dr. Brownlee. And I want to thank all of you people for coming here this evening. And hopefully we will be able to share some interesting information together, and maybe even come away with learning a few things that we didn't know about before. So also I want to thank McNally for providing this wonderful atrium in which to meet together. And thank you for John for his all the work that he's done to organize this event for us. So I want to talk about 4 organizing concepts that I used to put together all of the information that I was able to gather to put this book together. So one of the first concepts is subjectivity, and actually that's the title of my 3rd chapter. So subjectivity is self-identity in terms of, say, historical lineage, who your parents were and your foreparents. So I noticed when I was starting to do my research that, and I was reading various articles and books and so on, that there were 2 types of authors, basically, as I noticed. There are the authors who self-identify themselves in terms of the work that they've done, in terms of where they are in their careers, what they've accomplished, and what they would like to accomplish. Then there's the other group of authors and writers, and they're the Indigenous writers. And how they self-identify is, first of all, their heritage, their Indigenous heritage. So they talk about their home community, where they come from and who their people are and were, and also the lands in which they live, which part of the country they come from. So one time I was teaching a particular course in the history of the Indigenous peoples of Canada. So I was going through the textbook and I was familiarizing myself with it and also the author. And I tried to find some information about the author himself. And I couldn't see anything that identified him as Indigenous. So I presumed he wasn't Indigenous, but I thought, you know what, I shouldn't take that for granted. So I took it upon myself to email him and ask him about where he came from and what was his lineage. So he emailed me back and said that he was originally from Wisconsin, and that he only knew about his lineage 3 generations back. And after that, he couldn't say. But he said one of the reasons why he was in Indigenous, the field of his research, was because there were a lot of people around where he grew up who were Indigenous, who happened to be Anishinaabe, as it turned out. And so he said that, and then he said, and by the way, I'm not Indigenous myself. I'm not of an Indigenous extraction. So what was interesting about that idea was that when people self-identify as people say they can't go back any further than 3 or 4 or 5 generations, but they can't identify which part of Europe they came from. What happens with that is they begin to forget that they did originally come from somewhere else. And what happens to that is the actual Indigenous people, they get left out of the story. They come to be forgotten in that story of lineages, of the history of Canada and who were the founding people. So what happens with that is then the Indigenous people become silenced. They don't become a part of that discourse anymore, or they never did. And so they are invisibilized, and silenced and marginalized. And that continues to this day. In fact, if people don't try to find their lineages to Europe or some other place that they came from, then that's the way the narrative is, that Indigenous people were sort of just incidental and in the margins somewhere, but we're not really part of the stories of this nation. So that, I thought that was interesting. Now, my mother, Dedibaayaanimanook, and that's her face there in the map. What she always has done when she's told me her narratives was to always identify the sources of her information and her knowledge. Maybe it was an aunt or a great aunt. It could have been her grandmother or her grandfather or her parents. But she always told me where she got her knowledge from. The only time she didn't was if it was knowledge that she had gained from her own experiences. So what Dadibaajim does when she tells her stories in that manner is she's actually linking her identity to the original peoples. And she's keeping that linkage alive. And so I thought that was a really important thing that she did. And of course, she's also giving credit to the source of that knowledge. So that's my first concept. The other organizing concept is a term that's an Anishinaabe term, Mawad-Dishiwem, and that is actually I cover in chapter 2. So Mawad-Dishiwem is the notion of visiting together. And that is actually a very important institution of Anishinaabe people, Indigenous people. And what happens is they will say, for instance, if somebody caught a moose, then what they would do is they would share that with other members of the community. Now, for instance, in Trout Lake, Namegosibii, which is the outline, it's outlined in that map there. So different families would be living at various places on the lake, on the main shore or on an island. And what they would do is they would visit back and forth just to make sure everybody was well and that they didn't need anything. They were not in any need, but also to just share the latest news maybe even gossip. But so say, for instance, like I said, when somebody caught a moose, then they would take part of that moose carcass and they would share it with other members of the community. And that way they would stay in touch. And what they would do is Namegosibii is a mechanism whereby people held their communities together and they stayed, they kept up that sense of belonging to each other. So the third organizing concept that I have is the name of the chapter, chapter 7, and it's called Namegosibii Anishinaabeg. And I don't know if anybody here knows what Namegosibii means. It means the European descended people. Some people would say the white people. But anyway, so Namegosibii Anishinaabeg is a suffix that refers to the thinking, the way of thinking, the way of being, the way of organizing one's way of life. So one of the things that Anishinaabe people noticed when the Europeans and their descendants started to come into the lands was that they had a really notable way of organizing themselves, their lives. And one thing that they noticed about that was the notion of shunya was always behind almost everything they did. And shunya is another word for money. So they noticed right away that system that Namegosibii brought along was a certain economic system, which is actually capitalism, and that the way that they exercised capitalism was very driven. So they noticed that their resources were quickly depleted, that the logs were cut down, that the fish were fished to overly fished beyond what Anishinaabe people would ever use. And they noticed that that the land was being destroyed and all the resources. And when Namegosibii needed to have, say, electrical power to start their mines in operation, when they discovered gold, they would flood the rivers. They would dam the rivers and then flood the lands and the lakes, and thus do a whole lot of damage. And so it was a really stark contrast to the way that the Anishinaabe people had been living on the land in such a way, of course, that, for thousands of years, it could remain healthy and could remain definitely healthy. So all of a sudden, everything changed really, really quickly. So my fourth idea is Dadibaajim. So when Namegosibii started to enforce their value systems and their principles and their belief systems and their culture upon Indigenous people, then people started to have a whole, what was on their minds started to shift, and how they thought started to shift. So Dadibaajim is a word that means when you want to do something, you want to clear the clutter. Like, for instance, when we were little, we did everything at our kitchen table, and it wasn't a big table, it was quite small. So we did everything on there. So you can imagine it was always cluttered up. So when it was time for a meal, my mom would say, which means, well, it's time, let's clear off the table because we want to eat. So Dadibaajim, the way I use it, and I talk about it in chapter 1, is talking about clearing our minds of all that we have learned since we were born, and trying to open our minds so that we can think about other ways of looking at the world, of other ways of being in the world. And I think we know that we really do need to look at the world and how we use it quite differently now with the upcoming conference on climate change, things like that. So that was what I meant when I said my mom sees the relevance in her people's value systems and knowledges more so with every year that goes by on this earth. And that was all I want to say at this point.
Thanks, John. Good to go. Thanks so much, Helen, for that. Those thoughts that you opened with. I really enjoy that kind of conceptual thinking. You know, bringing us to think differently and trying to bring us into the Anishinaabe worldview. So Helen and I talked about how we wanted to frame tonight, and decided that it's going to be sort of an interview model in which I ask Helen a question, possibly just one question at the beginning, and she answers. So Helen, to start, would you tell us about your goals in writing this book?
Thank you, Dr. Brownlee. Yes, so I did give that a good thought. And I realized that probably one of the main objectives for writing this book was to discover who the people were that lived in Trout Lake, the mix in Trout Lake. Because when I started my research right at the beginning, I wanted to see what was written about the Trout Lake people. And I found that there really wasn't anything in the canon, the canonic text at all. And so people kind of talked generally in terms of the Anishinaabe people of a certain geographical area, but they didn't specify our people. So it was like we were subsumed in a larger group. And as a result, that the fact of our existence was overlooked. And so I realized that, okay, so there needs to be something done about that, because say for instance in Trout Lake, there are 4 tourist lodges there, and they're all owned by Americans and Canadians and whatnot. And they actually got to purchase that land, and that land is Crown land. It's actually a conservation and nature reserve. And so normally people are not allowed to buy that kind of land, and they're governed quite strictly how you can use it and how you use the resources. But when they were first opening up the land for themselves, I guess, then the government people said, yes, that they could purchase some of this land if they were going to do some kind of a commercial enterprise. And so these people built their lodges, and they had their paying guests come in. And in their minds, this was a lake that was uninhabited, that it was nobody's home, and it was theirs to just enjoy and use as they pleased. And meanwhile, their guides, who were Anishinaabe people, were the descendants of the people that had made Trout Lake their home. And the reason, of course, that they had to leave Trout Lake was because the government started to put in these strict regulations. For instance, that you couldn't live there year round, that you had to have, say, a proper wage in order to live there. And so in the summertime, the people would stay in Trout Lake and work at the lodges as all of the manual labor that requires a lodge to operate, and not realizing, of course, who these people were that were the guides. And there is actually a traditional cemetery there as well in Trout Lake, and they would, I guess sometimes they would go to that cemetery and wonder who these people may have been and how long it had been when they were buried there, not realizing that their descendants were among them. And so these people gradually became to see Trout Lake as theirs. In fact, some of those lodges are into the third generation of ownership. And these people, like the grandchildren of the original purchasers, they honest to goodness think that Trout Lake is their land, but they go home to the States every year, every fall, not realizing that, like I said, the guests' guides are the people whose homelands they are living in. I thought that was I thought that should be brought out. And that's probably the case all over the country. That's only one example. But so when I, when I thought about my mother's narratives and how replete they are with the lives and all of the activities that they did living on the land there in Trout Lake and appreciating and enjoying the pristine, clear water of the lake. In fact, when we look at the word Namegosibii, which is Trout Lake, Namegos refers to trout, and sip, Namegosibii, sip means a pure, clear water. And what Trout Lake is, it's a pure, clear, cool water that is spring-fed. And a lot of trout live where the waters are quite deep. And there are actually no major rivers that flow into Trout Lake. There is a river that flows out, but not in. Just little streams and things trickle in. So that is a very interesting, kind of a unique thing about Trout Lake. And it also sits at the height of lands. Anything to the north empties directly into Lake Winnipeg. Whereas Trout Lake's water trickles south and then west through Lake of the Woods, and then it meanders along the Winnipeg River and then up that way, Lake Winnipeg, up into Hudson's Bay and so on. And I was really amazed because one day my mom said to me, this was when she was telling me the narratives of the land itself, because what they would do is they would take 2 annual journeys each year, one in the spring, late spring, and the other in the early fall. So that it was always a canoe route, and it took them about 4 days. So it was a little bit quicker to go with the river, a little bit harder in the fall when they were traveling up to go home. And she said that she explained which way the river flowed, the waters of Trout Lake flowed, because she was on those waters twice a year. And she said, okay, after Manitoba, Manitou Falls, the waters that go west, she said they go west, and then they go somewhere else, but they wind up at she said the ocean, and so she knew that really ends up, which is the Arctic Ocean. And I don't think she's ever taken a course. In fact, she didn't ever go to school, not in the Western way but she certainly was educated. And so I was really amazed when I looked that up and discovered, yeah, she already knew that. And that she knew that Trout Lake was at the height of land, and that divided which way the waters would flow. And so I just thought that my mother's stories were so interesting, and that it really was evidence that there were people who lived there for a long, long time, and that we needed to know that.
Thank you. I'm curious, has your mother ever talked about, said anything about how long her people have been in that area?
Okay, so my mom, of course, doesn't talk in terms of time the way we do, but she does talk in terms of Bipoon. Bipoon is winters, so how many winters? It's a year. So she talks about, and actually she doesn't talk about number of years. She does talk about number of generations.
Right. That's what I wondered. Yeah.
Yeah. So she goes back to Gian, who was apparently the head trapper of that region with the Hudson's Bay Company. And they recognized him as a head trapper, as a lead trapper. And they, first of all, he had 6 wives, so he was very influential in the region. So he had a lot.
A heck of a hunter. That many wives.
A heck of something.
What it meant.
Heck of a something. Yeah. Yes. And so Hudson's Bay Company recognized his influence in the region, and they would hold a feast when he came. I was going to say when he came to town. No, when he came to the trading post, they would hold an annual feast for him to recognize that, okay, we're going to have a lot of trading going on. So they would celebrate that. And so, okay, so anyway, this lead trapper's name was Gian. And Gian had many children. And some of those children were our relatives that lived to the east of us. Okay, so one of Gian's children was Keesick, and Keesick was my mother's grandfather. So that would have been my great-grandfather. So, no, Keesick would have been my great-grandfather. So my great-great-grandfather was Gian. And so Gian existed about the late 1700s and the early 1800s. So that goes back that. So I could say her narratives to go back that far. And yeah, so Gian himself lived in Trout Lake, and he spent, I can't remember what was said where he spent his summers, but he certainly spent his winters in Trout Lake. And among the Anishinaabe people there, the major portion of their time was spent in Trout Lake and surrounding region rather than down at Black Sewer where they spent their summers for about 6 weeks. So the majority of the time of their time was in Trout Lake. So Trout Lake was their home. But all of those other regions where they trapped and hunted was part of their homeland territories.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
So you talked about the way that colonization has made Indigenous peoples invisible, and the way that actually colonization has been made invisible too for much of Canadian history. You know, these white people came in and we were told they could buy these lands and encouraged to think of them as their own and not to think at all about the people who came before and not to see them. And so your work partly makes this visible. And so I wondered, what would you like people to know that they don't seem to know about the history of your Anishinaabe people and about the effects of colonization?
A lot of the narratives. Okay, so I should first explain that I interviewed 8 people from the community. So I started off with 3 elders, of which my mother is the most senior. And so her stories are in the early 1920s. And so she covers, her stories begin there and then move forward. And then the next generation of people are the ones that are, say, of my age. And so they talk about boarding school and the effects of boarding school in their lives and how it completely severed what they should have been learning about the land and the history of the people. And so and a lot of them actually lost their language, but my cousins all retained Anishinaabe as their language, and they returned to Trout Lake as soon as they were able to get out of boarding school. So a lot of them only maybe went up to grade 6 or 7 and that kind of thing. So so all of those there's about, I would say there's 3 generations plus one person who is like the contemporary of, say, somebody a little older, my granddaughter, who's 7 now. Anyway, so they all had a slice of colonialism to talk about. its effects in their lives. And it's all interesting how colonialism began to usurp their lives in terms of how they thought. And so that today, when Indigenous our people, well, nobody lives in Trout Lake year-round anymore. They're not able to because of the regulations. So what they all live, some of them live in Red Lake, some live in Winnipeg and all over the place. But so in other words, they are very much acculturated into Western society. However, colonialism hasn't stopped affecting their lives, in the sense that colonialism also consists of prejudice, racism, preconceived ideas that just persist, and marginalization, those sorts of things. So they talk about that. Sometimes they don't talk directly about it, but it's there, and you can see it's there in how that affects their lives and how they're able to live in this society today. And then there are people like my mom who obviously live in this society today as well, but she has retained her teachings and her knowledge. And like I said, to her, what she sees today going on in the world is so just completely confirms the veracity of the Anishinaabe teachings of the elders about how you're supposed to live on the world, on the earth, and how you're supposed to respect it. And I think next 2 weeks or we're going to be having that conference on climate change, and I think it would be very interesting to see just how true, because Anishinaabe people, when they first saw how Wemtigushiwag were conducting themselves on the land, they immediately knew that this was not a sustainable way to live, that things were not going to go on forever like this, that it wasn't going to end well. And sure enough, today we see that's exactly what's happening. And I think my mom would see that right away, because she always saw that. She always saw that. Because, like I said, she wasn't enculturated in the society in terms of her value system and what she saw as how to live on this earth.
Yes, thank you. Are there teachings of hers about the Anishinaabe way of living on the land or living with the land that you'd like to share?
Sure. I think one of the ways that my mom never really specifically teaches stuff. She just tells her narratives, and then you pick it out in the story itself. So she always talked about their travels. I guess it must have been like a really exciting time for young children when they embarked upon these journeys. So for instance, say in the fall, and they would come up the river, they would come when the leaves were starting to fall. And she would talk about how they would stop at various places. For instance, the lake is still there. It's called Lake Pakwash. They called it Pakwash Isaikan. It means shallow lake. It's a large lake, but it's shallow. In the olden days, before the dams were built and the lakes were intact, they used to gather their medicinal plants there and on their way up, because they would gather enough to last them for the winter season and into the spring. And so she said that, and I always used to wonder, well, why didn't they, here's me with my Western thinking, well, why didn't they just take some of those plants and transplant and replant them in Trout Lake? Then they wouldn't have to stop there and depend upon, the land. But like my mom said, those plants were put there. That's their place of home. And we're fortunate that we have access to them. And so we don't disturb them that way. And so those are the kind of ways that they used the land, but used it in a way that didn't try to alter things, alter the way the land itself presented to the people, and that they used it with great respect. Also, like she described when they would go gathering rice in the fall on their way home, there was a specific place there just south of Manitoba, and it's sort of like just before the English River, just after the English River passes that. Oh, there's a place called Madawang. There used to be a Hudson's Bay post there as well, because that's the place where the two rivers converge. The English River going south, and then the Chikuni River that comes from Bagwashiwasaikan, from Trout Lake. And so she would describe how they would go about doing their harvesting. So there would be, say, maybe 3 families that would travel together to come up the river. So they would stop and they would have a ceremony, and they would ask that they would do things properly. So what they would do is they would look at the weather conditions, and back at that time they knew how to read the weather, read the environment, the sky, the night sky, and know that it was the right time to pick their wild rice. And so, they stopped their harvest as soon as they knew that they had enough for the winter for each of the families that were there. So they didn't try to take any more than what they knew they would use. And sometimes, for whatever reason, say if it rained or it was misty or there was a lot of moisture, then they knew that their rice wasn't going to last properly, because probably it would develop mold, something like that. And so they would be really disappointed, but disappointed in themselves, because in their minds they hadn't read the environment, the land properly. So that was how careful they were with how they used the resources of the land. And when they were gathering firewood, they would normally use the wood, trees that were already dead. So they would use that for firewood, but also for certain construction that they needed to do. And they were not ever wasting anything. And so one of my cousins, Kuishka'u, Liza, she talked about her parents and how she's my generation. So she said she observed how her parents, when they would say kill a moose, that there was a use for every part of that moose, and that there wasn't anything they wasted. Everything had a use. And so, and even how they traveled through the land was interesting, because they noted that when they would travel, say in the winter on the land, the way they would say brush up against the bough of, say, a spruce tree, that there was a certain fragrance that came out of that, and that was a medicinal thing for them. And it actually is, because there is a person who did studies on trees and saw that how very how healthy it is to live among the trees that way.
I'm wondering if I could be a little bit selfish and ask about something you talk about in your introduction. You talk about your book offering ideas for how to approach and academic work and research in a more appropriate decolonizing manner. And I wonder if you want to address that a little bit.
Sure. Sure. I can give an example. And it's about when my mom, okay, so my mom was telling me this story about her sister and her brother. They were probably young teenagers. Well, they were old enough anyway that their parents allowed them to go and visit the trading post, which was east of Trout Lake at Woman Lake or Swain Lake. It was Swain's post, George Swain's post. So they were allowed to go and there on their own. And so it was, they had to spend the night somewhere. So before they settled down, the brother, Charlie Anjanganeb, decided he was going to play a joke on his two sisters. And he came running down from the forest and they said to them, there are some white people, there are some Wemptigushiwak over there, and they're coming this way. And the way the two young women reacted was to be really fearful, to be afraid, and to dread the idea that they were going to meet up with these two Wemptigushiwak. And when she saw their reaction, he said, I was just joking. There's nobody here. And so when my mom was telling me that was all she said. And that was the end of that particular narrative. So, and I thought to myself, as a researcher, I would normally ask her, why were they fearful? What caused them to be so scared? What happened? Did they have some kind of an experience that made them scared? But see, when you're doing research in a way that respects Anishinaabe people, or any other people really, well, I should say Indigenous people whose teaching it is that you don't always ask questions directly. And so I didn't ask. So as I was working on my work, I realized that I had to think about the context in which my mother was in which that story happened, and what was going on in that part of the world at that time. And it was a time when it was considered to be, say, a frontier that was being explored, I guess, and conquered. And the Anishinaabe people were part of that environment. And so a lot of people did not respect Anishinaabe people in particularly. And so my mom and her sister, they had heard the stories of how Anishinaabe women were always, they always tried to be taken advantage of. And so, of course, my mom, her parents were always warning her, never, ever find yourself alone that way. And even though they had their brother with them, well, it was, that still didn't stop them from being afraid. So I think that's an example of how when you do research with Indigenous people, then you don't ask questions directly. Okay, so you just, either you have to just hold on to that thought and figure it out for yourself, or somewhere down the road, another narrative will come along and it will make that obvious, make your question obvious.
Can I ask a follow-up to that?
Sure.
This is very Wemptigushiwak behavior on my part, of course. But what don't you worry if you figure out for yourself why or what it means? Don't you worry that you might get it wrong?
Do I worry I'll get it wrong? If I got it wrong, I must say that in thinking back, but there really weren't that many instances where I had, well, actually, one time I was doing an interview with my mom and one of her nephews. His name was John Paul Keesick. He's since passed on, but so I had the tape recorder on, and so said something, and I asked him a question. And do you know, he just pretended I didn't ask any question. He just continued on with the narrative. And I thought, oh, okay, I better not. I better just be quiet and listen. And sure enough, when I went back afterwards and I started to listen to this tape, and I listened to the whole thing, and I could hear myself, that was a definite interruption. But he just chose to pretend it didn't happen. And then, by the end of his narrative, I had the answer. So you do have to wait. It doesn't always come. And here's another thing too. A lot of researchers have an idea. I don't think they as much anymore, but there was a time when researchers really thought that knowledge Indigenous people had was really rightfully theirs, so that they should have it. Whereas in reality, their knowledge it's a privilege to hear their knowledge, and that privilege is something that you have to earn, and that you have to wait for. You have to wait for whatever it is you want to know, because if they wanted you to know, then they will tell you. But if you ask, then either they're just going to not say anything to you, they're going to ignore you, or they will probably tell you something. They'll just change the subject. Okay.
Yes, I've heard of that happening too.
Yes.
Or the yes that means no, where they say, yes, you can interview me. No, but not now, tomorrow. And then tomorrow they disappear.
Which meant they didn't want to.
Right. So there's a lot of indirect communication, right? So you have to pay attention.
You really do. You really have to be conscious of it, of those kind of things, because that's their method of communication. Not always our way, but
I just want to ask if there's anything we haven't talked about that you want to make sure you mentioned.
Yeah, I think I know in our conversation last night on the phone, I was mentioning I had a slight fear of something. And I think that fear was I didn't want to come across as trashing dominant society. Because there are lots of good things about dominant society. And what's good is great. But there are certainly lots of things that that are really self-evident. You don't have to point it out. But if it's pointed out to you, you've seen it so often that you're not even aware of it anymore. And what I'm talking about is some of the pathologies of this society. For instance, when they hierarchize people, that some people are more valuable than others. And so we look around and we say, I wonder why we still have this homeless situation. And how come we can never seem to solve it? It's just always there. So that really just tells you there's something wrong with society, with how society is functioning, with how society is treating members that are part of it. And so there are certain groups that tend to be in that category compared to the other members of dominant society. So I think a lot of these things you can pick out that are illnesses of the society. And of course, we all know the many. Okay, so I'm not saying all capitalism is bad, but certainly rampant capitalism is pretty awful. And I think, like, historically, how even just laborers were treated, and a lot of times it was a matter of life and death. So it can be very ruthless, even amongst their own people, never mind people they look at as less than.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I would add that the treatment of workers wasn't bad only in the past. even right up to the present.
Yes. So yeah, I think that people today don't often understand what colonialism is, and that it actually, some people say we're living in a post-colonial, whereas it's actually neo-colonialism, and that colonialism just took on a different form, and that it's becoming even more intensified with just noticing that there are maybe 5 people who own so much of the wealth of this world. In fact, the other day when Prince William made his comment, he was critiquing the people who went up to space, like they went up there for 2 minutes or something, and paid all that money to do that. And he said, instead of wealthy people using their wealth to go and try to find another planet to live on, how about using your money to try to fix the one that you just ruined? I thought that was awfully good of a member of the royal family to make note of that. And so it took somebody from this very young generation to see that and say it.
Yes. Thank you. Well, I feel like we've said quite a bit, and maybe it'd be time to allow others to ask some questions.
Yes, indeed. So we just have reached the top of the hour, but if anybody does have any pressing questions right now, either physically here in the space or on YouTube, please do feel free to put up your hand or write a question in the chat. Otherwise, we'll move along to the book signing.
She's probably asking, when can I go home?
Yeah, where's the cake? Where are the cookies? Shouldn't there be cookies at this event?
Well,
Maybe she's asking why no one else has cat ears.
Which is a very valid question to ask at any event, to be fair. Well, if there are no questions, I can turn things over to Dr. Agger and Dr. Brownlee for any final words they might have, and then I can go over some thrilling signing procedure with you all.
Do you have anything you want to add?
no, other than to just thank everybody for coming. It's really great to see you, and I hope that that you have something that you can come away with, and that the knowledge is that it flows both ways. That I am just as willing to learn as teach, and listen as well as speak. So thank you again.
Thank you so much. So everyone is now going to buy a book, and it's probably obvious from listening to Helen tonight how much you will get from this book, but I just want to say that I feel that the previous book just lives in me, and this is the teachings just come back to me all the time. So I want to thank you so much for the work you do.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jarvis. Thank you for agreeing to be a part of this. Really appreciate it.
My honor.
I am going to continue with the gratitude, as that was such a fascinating, multifaceted and open presentation. So thank you so very much, both of you. We will now move along to the signing portion of the evening. So we'll ask you to remain seated for just one moment when we relocate Dr. Agger just to the table immediately beside our cash desk. At that point, you can feel free to descend. There are copies of the book that are available for sale at the cash desk. You can also get it signed before you pay for it. All we ask is that you do pay for the book at some point over the course of the evening. I'd like to thank all of you for joining us here physically, on YouTube virtually, both now and in the future. This video will remain live if you'd like to revisit it or share it with anybody who might benefit from its contents, since this certainly was so much discussed here this evening. We're very grateful to the University of Manitoba again for putting this all together. Again, the book is Dadibaajim, Returning Home Through Narrative, the new book from Dr. Helen Olsen Agger. Please join me once again in thanking her and all of tonight's participants.